we might make a start. And this is the annual and financial reporting webinar for members who need to fulfil their annual reporting requirements under the ACFID code. Primarily, I'm aiming this one for those who are coming round now for the December end year reporting period. But obviously, the webinar is for anyone who might need to know about the requirements at any time, and so it's a good refresher for everyone in any case. So my name's Joe D'Angelo, and once again I'll ask check with everyone to make sure that they can hear me, because there are a few that actually haven't responded. So I've got a list here showing Abdullah and Lieutenant Colonel. I haven't heard from you. It'd be nice if you could let me know that you can hear. So just quickly go over the objectives for this morning. So it is to look through the Code of Conduct annual and financial reporting requirements, to give you a few tips on how to meet those requirements, things to watch out for. I'll go over problem areas that we continue to see. So for those of you listening this morning, I hope that you can tackle those problem areas and just make sure your annual and financial reports are code compliant. And we'll have an opportunity for questions as well. But you can type in questions at any time, and I'll keep an eye out on the ticker tape there, and I'll be able to respond as they come through. I'll also be flicking between the presentation and the ACFID website to show various things. So watch out for that. So we've got two documents. One I've already mentioned is the Code of Conduct. This shows the cover of the little booklet we publish, but obviously it's all available online these days. And in fact, why don't I flip to show you, flip to the website to show you how that looks these days. So what I've gone to now is under Code of Conduct tab, and use the code. We also have the Good Practice Toolkit. So that's the second main document we use in terms of complying with the annual reporting requirements of the code. With the annual report bit of the Good Practice Toolkit, it's in a unique position in the sense that C.2.2 of the financial statement section of the toolkit is viewed as being part of the code. So the financial statements bit is where all the financial reporting requirements are laid out, and you'll note there's a note there that makes it clear that the financial statements bit forms part of the Code of Conduct. So that's quite a unique aspect of this bit of the toolkit. So that's pretty much how the new website looks like. I encourage you to have a look at that. Anytime you need to look something up in terms of preparing items for your annual report or your financial statements, to make this your first port of call as a reference point for those reporting requirements. So the main bits of the code that we cover today is called C.2 annual reporting, which has three elements there. There's also a tiny bit of C.3.6 and 7 under fundraising. There's a couple of mandatory items under there that we expect to see within your annual reports. And D.4 financial management covers off the auditing financial statements. So obviously we have requirements around independent audit reports. So they're the bits of the code that are what we're interested in this morning. This quickly summarises your annual reporting requirements more broadly, not just the annual report and financial statements, but obviously somewhere in your organisation there'd be people preparing what we call the CSA, the compliance self-assessments, and these are required to be submitted to us pretty much at around the same time each financial year, or at the end of each financial year. In fact, the exact deadline is 5 months from the end of your financial year or reporting period. So that happens every year. In relation to the annual report, I split the presentation up into 5 broad areas. The first 2 cover off the body of your annual report. There's a whole lot of items that we expect to see within the annual report, what I might call your narrative. These are the more descriptive aspects of your annual reports. There's a small section on what you need to do if you put in ratios and graphs within parts of your annual report. And then the final 2 sections are about the financial reporting requirements. And generally speaking, it's normal that your annual report gets split between what I might call the body of the annual report, the narrative, and the financial reporting bits, or the financial statements. Often there's a bit of a delineation between the 2. So it's for that reason that I sort of split the discussion up between the 2. And in one sense, that the code sort of follows that delineation as well. So with the annual report basics, we're looking at C.2 of the code. C.2 once again covers annual reporting, and then there are 5 key things we expect to see in the body of the reports, the annual reports, that are covered off in this section of the code. And for the most part, these are fairly basic requirements. And what I mean by that is most of these things are fairly generic annual report type inclusions. They're the sorts of things I'd really expect to see in pretty much any type of annual report. So I have experience within the public sector, within the Commonwealth Government, preparing annual reports, and we would include many of these sorts of things in our annual reports. And you'll even find these sorts of things in even commercially oriented annual reports. So for me, these are very basic annual report requirements that I would expect to see in any type of annual report. And so they do include the organisation's purpose. So generally speaking, there'd be a bit of a summary somewhere outlining the mission statement of the organisation, its purpose, its values, whatever you might wish to call it. It's nice to have that as a discrete item sitting somewhere in a box or in a front page, or as an intro to the annual report. It might be covered off in the chairperson's statement, or it might sit on the page in the margins, or somewhere where you're re-emphasising what your organisation's all about. So, and then we expect to see a plain language summary of the organisation's financial information. And this is an area that a lot of our members have trouble with. What we mean here is, within the body of the annual report, it's fairly standard to have a small paragraph or a little box or a little description in narrative form of the financial outcome of the organisation for the financial year. So yes, you'll see the financial figures and the detail in the financial reporting section, but in the body of the annual report, it's quite normal just to have a little blurb about how you went that year. We went as expected. We did this, we did that in financial terms. We spent a bit more here. We did better than we expected in terms of our income over here, and our outcome was pretty much on budget or whatever. So usually you'll see a little blurb about describing the financial outcome of the organisation for that year. And then the next bit is your most significant aid and development activities for the year. And once again, a fairly standard annual report inclusion. What did you do that year? A description of everything you did that year. And then related to that, the next bit are evaluations of what you did. So how did it go? Did it achieve what you set out to achieve? How do you go about, as a matter of course, in sort of measuring how well you're doing? And so you could dedicate a page or two or on either that for the organisation for the year as a whole, or you could include a couple of sentences under each area that you've described as to whether it was evaluated and what you did. So with this item, we don't expect everything to be evaluated year on year, but we would anticipate that on an ongoing basis, some elements of your operations are getting evaluated. You have information available on your performance, on how it went, and you're including snippets of that either in a discrete area in the annual report or scattered through the annual report where you're describing your activities for the financial year. And the final line item there is, once again, very standard inclusion, a report by management or the governing body. Could be the chairperson, could be the CEO, could be a combination of those. Sometimes you might see 2 or 3 of these sorts of reports. Occasionally even the CFO will have a report, and you know, that might well be the plain language summary I'm referring to further above. So a bit of a report from a person in authority in the organisation about the year, summarising the year. And you'll often see that up front somewhere in the annual report, very early in the piece. So once again, very standard inclusions. We cover them in the code, but these are the sorts of things I would expect to see in pretty much any type of annual report. Having said that, we have a pattern of some of these items not being included, and I will touch on those and re-emphasise those later in the presentation. In this section here about the logo, I mean, firstly, let me state it's optional whether you do use the ACFID logo, but if you do choose to use it, please make sure you choose the most current one. You can look that up on the website to see what is the most current one, and you can download the JPEG of it. But the main reason I highlight the logo is because I find personally that the better practice annual reports, the best laid out annual reports, the ones that I find easiest to read, they will often dedicate a page or a box to ACFID, to the code, and to fulfilling some of these requirements of the code within this one area. So I believe that's a very good practice. So it's one I would encourage your organisations to follow. So you have a little box with the ACFID code explaining that you're a member of ACFID, and obviously that's meant to be a positive. That's why you are a member. And then within that box or that half page or whatever the case might be, or might be on the inside of the cover of the annual report. I mean, it can be anywhere. But you keep these things together under the ACFID code, and they include these various notes, comments, or statements that require under the code. And the first one there is about commitment to the code. And so what I've included there, and I know it's a bit wordy to look at as a presentation, but you can use this as a reference to come back to at a later time. These are an example of a form of words that meets that requirement within the code, that you do need to state your commitment to the code. And we really do want to see a statement that says you are committed to the full adherence of the code. We'll occasionally sort of get forms of words that play around that or don't quite get to the heart of it, or simply say that they follow the code, but the requirement in the code, as it's currently worded, is that you have a statement in there about your commitment to the code. The next paragraph there covers off two requirements under the annual reporting code, both referring to complaints. So there are two statements we need members to make that relate to complaints, and they are about identifying the ability to lodge a complaint against yourselves and who or what the point of contact is, and then an ability to lodge a complaint of the code to ACFID, against the ACFID code, and the means by which people can do that. So that last paragraph has a form of words that covers off those two complaints mechanisms. So one going to your organisation, or one in relation to the ACFID code that involves ACFID. In the example given, there's an email address where members of the public can make a complaint pursuant to the code of conduct. So just to summarise, a good practice I find, just from my observation the past year, of the best annual reports, that you have a page or half page or a column or box dedicated and describing your membership of ACFID, where you'll show the logo, the correct logo, and you'll cover off these various statement requirements under the code about commitments and about complaints. Now, moving on, and this is sort of this wraps up the body of the annual report, the narrative part of the annual report. There's a separate requirement in another part of the code. It's not under the annual reporting part of the code, but we bring it in here because it's relevant, and that is under C.3.7, which covers fundraising. If you disclose any ratios relating to your admin or fundraising costs, you must provide a reference or note as to where those numbers are coming from. So it's just to emphasise accountability and transparency, to show to the public that the figures being shown, or the ratios or whatever, have an evidentiary basis. More often than not, the numbers are coming from this year's financial statements, so you can note that, or they might be coming from another source. Wherever they're coming from, we require a footnote that explains where any numbers underpinning ratios or graphs are coming from. This is a good time to open up for questions. Are people still online? I haven't had any activity for a good 10 or 15 minutes from anyone else. It'd be nice, even if... thanks, Gareth. Anyone else there? I haven't put everyone to sleep already. Jan's responding. At least if you start typing something, I can... Thanks, Diana and Abdullah. Thank you. Oh yeah, great. your little avatars pop up to show you're typing something. So that's all good. Thanks very much for that. No questions from anyone about that. So that does cover off the body of the annual report, what I call the narrative part of the annual report. And as you can see, look, I think it's relatively straightforward, that bit. But we do find plenty of examples where thanks, Annika. We do find, look, probably too many examples of members who just leave one or two of those things out, whether it's just oversight or what it is, I'm not sure. And we're really working hard to try and overcome that by providing the support. I'll mention at the very end about in fact, why don't I do it now? I'll just go back onto the toolkit. So just to mention, under the annual report bit of the toolkit, under transparency, you'll find resources, and very recently I've added a checklist, and the checklist is aimed at helping people go through these various requirements one by one, and you'll find there's the annual report. Once again, when I talk about the annual report, I'm talking about the body of the annual report, and just those bits and pieces I've mentioned just then to you, they're all sitting here one by one, and I think it would be even if it was if it became an ingrained part of your process that you simply go through this checklist when you're at the draft stage of your annual report, or even when you're in the middle of preparing your annual report, or even at the very start, just to make sure you've captured everything. And so this is intended to be just a very simple checklist that lays out the various requirements in hopefully in plain language. Okay, so we'll move on then. So now we're up to the financial statements bit, and as I mentioned earlier, this would generally be there'd be a clear delineation between where the body of the annual report ends and the financial statements bit starts. Different members will show that delineation in different ways. Some fancy reports will use different colour paper, or there might be a page that clearly shows that the financials are about to start, or it might be introduced by a separate table of contents or something. Generally speaking, there'll be some delineation to show, okay, these are the financials coming. Some emphasise this more than others, so I don't say there's anything mandatory around that, but it's fairly normal, even within a medium-sized organisation, to treat the two bits of the annual report. But generally speaking, there'll be different parts of the organisation doing both bits of the annual report. Of course, the smaller the organisation is, the more likely there's one person doing everything. So I understand that as well, and I've certainly been there as well. So just a few quick points about the financial statements, and I'll go in a bit more detail with each of these. Firstly, and you'll find this under the toolkits, the Good Practice Toolkit, we have two options for financial reporting that divide you up between smaller organisations and the larger organisations, and generally, so it's option 1 and option 2. Generally speaking, your option 2 organisations are medium to large organisations, and they just are required to do a little bit more. And with the smaller organisation under option 1, it's a more summarised form of reporting. So we try and I guess cater for all sized members and try and make it as easy to comply with the code for everyone, even those members who don't have a lot of resources at their disposal. So we allow a more summarised form of reporting. There's a reference to another bit of the code there. You must have a note somewhere that says these financial statements have been prepared in compliance with the code. That note can appear anywhere. It could be the intro of the financials. It could be as a footnote to the financial statements. It could be in the note to the financial statements. But somewhere you must be stating unequivocally that you have prepared these financial statements in compliance with the code. Now, one final note there that I've included on this slide is that I find there's a lot of confusion amongst the membership about this distinction between the preparation of full financial statements, or what we might call your statutory accounts for those members who are incorporated and might have statutory requirements either under Commonwealth Corporations Law or under state-based incorporated associations type regulations. So some members have trouble distinguishing between those full financial statements and what we require to be included within the annual report. Our requirements under the code are not for the full financial statements to be included in the annual report. We only require what are fairly summary type financial statements. So even for the option twos, they are summary statements in comparison to your full financial statements. Members can choose to put their full financial statements in the annual report, so that's fine as long as they're code compliant. You can choose to do that, or you can choose just to do the statements required by the code, put them in the annual report, but then also choose to submit your full financial statements along with your annual report. So I'll try and explain all that a bit more as we go, but just for the moment, I just want to make that clear distinction between what are your full financial statements, which you're producing for statutory purposes, and what are the financials we include in the annual report under the code. They really are two different things, although some members choose to treat them as one, and that's an option that all members have. But the starting point is, in fact, that they are two different things. So let's cover both options now. And option one, as I said, are our smaller members, and that is they would have revenue of less than $250,000, and they only need to include 3 things within the annual report. So these are items you need to include in your annual report. We're not talking about your statutory requirements. If you're an incorporated body, you have other statutory requirements. These are the statements we expect to see in your annual report. So there's a short form income statement, and as I said earlier, for the smaller members, we only need a more summarised form of that income statement. We'll call it a short form income statement. There's a table of cash movements, which I'll explain in a moment, and then there's your independent audit report. They're the 3 things we require of option ones, smaller members. We're relevant. We also need, we need this of all members, a reference to the availability of your full financial statements. So as I said in my intro to the financial statements, we have a clear distinction between what the code requires you to include in your annual report and and the full financial statements you might be producing for statutory purposes. We have a clear distinction between the two. So if you've gone down the route of just including the summarised statements under the code, but you also have a separate full set of financial statements, you just need to have a reference in your annual report that says they are available. So whoever wants a copy of your full financial statements can get those. And all this is about accountability and transparency. So for the annual report purposes, we only need summary financial information in the main to describe your international aid and development activities. But we are saying to the public, the full financial statements are available and they're here if you want to view those as well, and they would be done to whatever statute that is applicable. This is an example of an option 1 income statement. So once again, it's shorter than the income statement we require of our larger members. Donations and gifts, grants and other income. So there's only 3 revenue items. And we reduce the expenditure items to 4 main items, and we include international programs as 1 line item. In the longer form, we split that up into 2 items. So it's just a more summarised version. This is a rule that applies to everyone, and that is, and this is why it's important to always refer to the toolkit. The code has a very clear very clear requirement that if you have a zero balance in terms of one of these line items, for example, a lot of our members won't have community education expenses. If that's a zero, you either must include the line item with the zeros or have a footnote saying we didn't spend anything on community education or words to that effect. Often the footnote treatment will work really well where you might have some members have quite unique activities and have a lot of zeros against the line items. So it might be, I guess, more aesthetical to not include all the zeros on the face of the statement and to have a footnote saying we didn't incur any expenses for these items or didn't earn revenue for these items. The table of cash movements, this is the one statement that applies to both options, as it makes it clear in the title there. It's identical for both, and it's about showing your accountability for monies that have been collected for designated purposes and tracking them from start to finish. So the table's designed to show opening balances, what's been received during the year, what's been spent during the year, what's the closing balance for what you might call buckets of money for designated purposes. You only need to prepare the TCM where your cash raised for designated purposes exceeds 10% of total international aid and development revenue. So we have a discrete item that makes up more than 10% of the total, then you must have a TCM that tracks the money flows for that discrete item. Where your activities are generic and you don't have discrete buckets of money, for want of a better description, then you do not need to produce this TCM, but you would need to put a statement. Then you do not need to produce this TCM, but you would need to put a statement in your financial statements, and this is often an oversight or forgotten by members, so please take note of this. So if you don't meet that 10% test, you need to include a statement or words to the following effect, and it's there at the bottom of the slide there. No single appeal, grant or other form of fund raising for a designated purpose generated 10% or more of the organisation's international aid and development revenue for the financial year. So you can do without the TCM, but you must include that statement, obviously where it applies. This is an example of a TCM. So you've got your designated purpose in the first column. You might have one or two purposes, and you have your opening figure, you have the cash raised during the year, the cash dispersed during the year, and then you have your closing figure, and obviously all that should balance. Now the bit in red is very important. We expect that final figure in the bottom right corner to reconcile with the cash disclosed in your balance sheet. They should be one and the same. And the way you should always be able to achieve that is that you have a line item that covers all other non-designated purposes. So, you might have two designated purposes that make up 30, 40, 50% of your total cash flows. You'll have a third line item that has the balance. And so you'll always be able to reconcile back to the balance sheet. Option 2. So option 2 is where, I've got a question here. Is there any pro forma for recording non-monetary income and expenditure? Pro forma for, generally speaking, the non-monetary items will be a single line item in both the revenue and expenditure side, and they should always be equal and balance out. So I'm unsure Phil, what you mean by the pro forma? Is that about an internal process, how you track it within your organisation, or is that about how you cost it out? Is that yes, there are set rates. Well, there are not set rates, there are recommended rates. So ACFID does not set rates, but within the toolkit, you'll find, and this is under the definitions in section F of the Good Practice Toolkit, you'll find links back to DFAT, and DFAT have recommended rates for a whole list of positions, and you can certainly use those, and they will be satisfactory for audit purposes. But ACFID itself does not mandate any set rates. So that link to DFAT is just there for reference and good practice purposes. The option 2, we require that little bit more of our larger members, and that's anything over $250,000 of revenue, which will be the bulk of our membership. We just have those higher expectations. So it's a longer form income statement, very similar to the one we saw, but it just expands a few of those items. It might there'd be subcategories of grants, subcategories of international aid expenditure. I'll show an example in a minute. We have the table of cash movements, so that will be identical requirements there. You must have a balance sheet. So once you reach a certain size, we have the expectation that you will include a balance sheet. Now, obviously, in preparing your statutory accounts, you will have a balance sheet anyway. So, and for the most part, the balance sheet you use in your statutory accounts will be the same balance sheet that you can plunk into your annual report. So that won't cause any extra work. For most organisational types, you'll need to do a statement of changes in equity, and what that does is sort of reconcile your income statement and your balance sheet in terms of the equity bit, and then once again you need an audit report. Pardon the look of this slide. So obviously with the option 2 income statement, it's the longer form income statement. So we split up. We have a few extra splits. As I said, with grants, we have 3 subcategories for the categorisations. Under international programs, we split up, further split that up into funds to international programs and program support costs. These are all defined in section F, as mentioned at the bottom of the slide. Fundraising costs, they get split up as well. And that's the main difference between, option 1 and option 2, that there are further subcategories of financial data that's required to be disclosed. The same note, as I mentioned in option 1, applies here. If you have a nil balance, you must disclose it, either as a line item or as a footnote to the statement saying you have not incurred this expense item or you've not earned revenue under this item. Why do we do that? It's because the membership has decided that these are worthwhile disclosure items, that these are line items that are relevant to our sector, and we see it as a form of accountability and transparency to emphasise that a particular item is in fact zero. It's not there because it's zero. So it just emphasises and shows quite transparently that an item is in fact zero. And also, following these rules quite closely allows comparability of numbers across the sector. So they're the sorts of reasons why we're sort of quite strict on that. So if you have an item that's zero, that you're not showing as zero, it's not showing up anywhere, either as a line item or as a footnote, we would describe that income statement as non-compliant, and as part of our assessment process, we would seek remedial action. We would actually ask you to fix that income statement. Generally speaking, we would only do it for the web version of your annual report. We'd ask you to change the web version of your annual report. And for some members that can cause consternation because the board's approved the annual report. It's their formal and final annual report. So these little things can cause some members, not all, but some members, some consternation. But it does mean that if an item isn't complying with the code, it would mean you would not receive your certificate of compliance for that financial year. So it is important. Look, it's best to try and get it right up front, and that's sort of best for everyone. The final area, so they're financial statements. The final bit, obviously closely related with the financial statements, is the audit reports and governing body declaration. So regarding the audit reports, that's under a separate clause, D.4, but it's also touched on in the annual reporting section of the code as well. So you must include an independent audit report in your annual report. Must do it. This can mean that you could end up with 2 audit reports, one for your statutory accounts and one for your annual report. And that is correct, but that is the requirement as currently worded. And it must match. Now, what do we mean by that? The audit report that gets included in your statutory accounts will usually, nearly always, be referencing different financial statements to what have been shown in your annual report. For example, there may not be a table of cash movements in your statutory accounts. You would have a statement of cash flow, so they're different statements. Have a similar purpose, but they are different. So the audit report in your statutory accounts will reference the statement of cash flows. In your annual report, we would want that audit report to reference the table of cash movements, if it's there. So we do have this requirement that the audit reports that you put in your report must reference the statements that you've included in your annual report. We've got a note here to watch out for page numbering. So some members do, in fact, include their full financial statements in the annual report, which is fine. That's optional. But where you do that, just watch out for the page numbering, because often the two have been prepared at different times or by different people, separate documents, and they will often, so we'll often come across an annual report where the members obviously plonked the full financial statements into the annual report, but it's kept the old page numbering of the original financial statements. So just watch out for that. It's not a compliance issue, but just it's not a great look. The other requirement regarding auditing is that you need to show the audit certificate, the audit report, needs to identify the auditor and show their contact details and qualifications. Look, as a matter of course, most auditors will just have all that in their letterhead, and the audit report will be provided on their letterhead, and that will show up in your annual report. And so that requirement will, generally speaking, just get covered off as a matter of course. And of course, it should be signed. I think that goes without saying. The governing body declaration, this is a generic term we use, but it might have different names depending on what kind of incorporated body you are. If you're a company under corporations law, that's a director's declaration, and then under the various state regulations in relation to incorporated associations, it might have a slightly different name, but it's the exact same thing. And generally speaking, you're making very similar statements about statements being prepared pursuant to the accounting standards, true and fair view of the financial position, etc., etc. We do not need this governing body declaration in the annual report. We do not. If you've prepared a separate set of full financial statements, generally speaking, the governing body declaration will be in that, and if that is sent to us, this requirement is covered off. So it does not need to be in the annual report, but if you want to put it in the annual report, that's optional. That's for you to decide. Some members do it. I'd say the majority probably don't, but it's not a requirement of the code to have it in the annual report. And now we'll just finish off with a few bits and pieces. These are just useful reference items. The Good Practice Toolkit has a section F where various definitions are included, and things such as fundraising, definition of fundraising, the definition of accountability and administrative costs, which is one of the line items. Within your organisations, you might call these a number of different things in your financial system, corporate overheads or admin, general admin or whatever. But it's pretty much a similar set of items that are included in these sorts of category of costs across the board. Another opportunity for questions, because we're getting near the end now. Can you quickly give me a hint that people are listening? I can tell you it's a little bit weird sitting in a room on my own and talking to myself. So if I can see a few things flashing, that's all good. Or a bit less than last time. So I'm concerned. Some people may have dropped off already. So any questions? All good. Thanks, Abdullah. Okay. Well, so we're in the final stretch now. So this is where I just wrapped up with a few other things. I touched on very briefly touched on the compliance process and how any one of these items, if they're not in the annual report, we will seek remedial action, either formally or informally. Often, if it's a tiny thing, I might quickly call you and say, "Oh, do you think you can quickly fix this item? I've just noticed it. I'm pretty sure it's an oversight," and generally it will be, and say, "Oh yeah, we'll just quickly fix it," and that's fine. So I won't worry about letters or anything. If there are a number of things, that generally will be a letter. But this is a good opportunity to mention the compliance portal, and so we are gradually, or have gradually changed the way we go about things. And once upon a time, well, it's been a long time since people sent hard copies of their reports. Occasionally it still happens, but for the most part, they're either coming in via email, or have been coming in via email or with links to the annual report on the website. And now the most recent change has been the compliance portal. And in fact, from now onwards, we would be requiring all annual reports and financial reports to be sent through via the compliance portal. And I'll quickly show you how to get that. So it's all under. So this is the ACFID website, and in the top ribbon you'll see My ACFID. Most of you will already have access to My ACFID. If you don't, shoot me an email and we'll make sure we get you access. Or generally speaking, you can actually do it via the website itself. So there's a box down the bottom here called Comply with the Code, and so there's bits of information about our various compliance requirements more broadly. And then you've got a dot point here called the Online Compliance Portal, and unfortunately you have to drill down a few times, but this takes you to a page describing bits and pieces of the portal. But also you'll find various links of guidance, technical guidance, getting started, how to complete the CSA. So there's extra information on those bits and pieces. And then there's something called Enter the Compliance Portal. And unfortunately, I can't get in with this user, but this is as far as I can go currently. But you will then come to a screen, and apologies for not having that screen available for you. You'll come to a screen where you can either do the CSA on one side, or you can lodge your annual and financial report on the other, on the right-hand side, and you go there, and it's just a simple matter of inserting the documents you want to lodge, and it just happens thereafter. So it's not too difficult. Okay. Oh, so I just saw a question from Jan. When do we send annual report to ACFID? Oh, okay. So Jan, depending on the size of your organisation, sometimes they'll all come in. Well, sorry, the recent practice has been that they come in by email, but you should now try and use this compliance portal that I just showed how to navigate, and contact us about getting users set up. We set up users for the roles for the CEO, for the chair, and for the compliance person. Plus, we can set up other users. You do the CSA online, so you don't actually attach the CSA. You actually do it online, and once it's been submitted by both the chair and CEO, it's visible to both you and us, and it's all done online. And from now on, all feedback will be online. Now, this is the CSA we're talking about here. My colleague Sarah does a webinar on the CSA in 1 or 2 weeks, so she'll go through the CSA process in a bit more detail. So the CSA is done online through the compliance portal, but there's an option under the compliance portal where you can lodge your annual and financial reports, one or two documents, and that's just a matter of following the buttons and using the insert buttons. So Jan, or the compliance person will generally complete the CSA, so they're completing it online, but and that's visible to your CEO and chair because they'll have logons. It's they who must submit it, so they both must submit it, not together. They can do it separately, but when the second one of those two submits it, it then becomes visible to us at our end. It only becomes visible to us at our end when it's been formally submitted by the chair and CEO. Now, I'm not saying they are preparing it. Someone else would prepare it, but they would be the ones that submit it. So there's a separate button for submission. And once again, apologies, I couldn't show you that on screen. Yes, and only upon the second person submitting will we see it at our end. But it's all online, so the very first CSA you do will require a little bit of effort because you're almost doing it from scratch. So you may have got used to sort of going over your previous versions of the CSA. You'll now have to go through that online CSA from scratch, but it's worth the effort because from next year you'll then be able to automatically copy the previous years. So we can't copy the previous years this year because we're starting the online version from scratch, but from future years you'd be able to copy your previous year's responses. So that's just an important point to keep in mind. It will take a little longer than normal in your first year, and then it will get easier thereafter. So just going over some tips, useful tips. If you have received a compliance letter from the previous year, just worthwhile just double checking that nothing's outstanding, or sometimes that letter will give some best practice tips. And what I'm saying there, what I'm trying to say there is there might have been a small compliance issue we're just not worried about, and we've handed out the certificate of compliance, but we've said in the letter, please make sure you fix this for next year. So please do that. Otherwise, it will become a compliance issue if it's not done 2 years running. I've referred to the financial definitions in Part F. The financial templates, the toolkit shows, if you like, the pro formas for the various financial statements. The important bit there are that the line items need to be used as said, and you must include all those line items. You can include more line items, so that's an important point. You can actually introduce extra line items if it fits your business, but you must have our line items as a minimum, or have a footnote saying that you didn't have any expenditure or revenue in those items. 5 months submission, I've mentioned earlier. So point 5, to repeat, we occasionally get members who send in the annual report without any financials and then send in the financial statements separately. You can't do that. We need financials in the annual report. They must be code compliant financials. As they are summarised, but they must be in the annual report. To reiterate, we need an audit report in the annual report that references the statements that have been placed in the annual report. The table of cash movements applies to everyone, and you either need to include it or need to include a note saying that you're exempt from having to do it because you didn't meet the 10% test. And then there's the various statements that you need to include in the body of the annual report, a commitment to the full adherence to the code, and the 2 complaints statements need to be included. I covered off the ratios, the requirement to reference where the information is coming from, and I also mentioned the governing body declaration. Once again, to reiterate that you do not need to include it in the annual report. It's not mandatory. We just need to receive it, and by sending your full financial statements to us, or lodging it rather than the compliance portal. I better get used to the new language. You'll be lodging it in the compliance portal. By lodging your full financial statements, that, as a general rule, will already include your governing body declaration, so you'll be covered there. And this is my final, or one of my final slides. And so from the past year, I've listed the most common compliance issues that arise in annual reporting. So, up to about 20% of everyone is having one or more of these items. And I think they're all avoidable. So I'd like to just take a minute to sort of re-emphasise and reiterate all of these, because they are avoidable. The lack of plain language summary of financials. Once again, what I'm talking about there is somewhere in the body of the annual report. It could be a couple of sentences, it could be a small paragraph, it could be a little text box. There's a myriad ways that you could cover this off. Just explaining in summary form, in words, what appears in the financial statements. And if you like, you can expand on that to relate it to last year, or describe things that have happened that have meant your expenses are greater or lower, or revenues greater or lower, or whatever the case might be. That's what we mean by the plain language summary of the financials. And from my point of view, a good annual report should always have something like that, because not everyone is going to look at the financials. Not everyone likes looking at financial numbers. So the idea of the plain language summary is to provide a description that people can read, and that's what we call the plain language summary. Another question's come through. Does ACFID issue a compliance letter stating the annual report was compliant, or only if there would? Oh, no. There are a number of possible letters. You can receive a letter if you require remedial action, but you definitely do receive a letter when everything's compliant, and when we send it, we still do send the certificate out in hard copy. That's still done, and that's accompanied by a letter saying both the annual reporting and CSA requirements are compliant. The letter will generally explain whether we've looked at one or the other or both, because we don't actually look at everyone's every year. We have a rolling assessment process. You will always get reviewed for both over a 3-year period, but you won't necessarily get reviewed for both every single year. Sometimes it might be one of them, sometimes it might be none of them. The certificate of compliance letter, so if we're talking about the June 2015, they're in the process of being assessed now. For the Decembers, they're not required to put their items in until May of this year, in 2 months' time. And generally speaking, you're talking 5 months after that period. I'll continue with the non-compliance issues. Lack of information on evaluations. Yeah, so similar to the first one. Yeah, I'd say around 20% of all members over the past year have failed to include any information on any form of evaluation. Now, I know for some of the smaller members, they find this a big ask, but there's always something you can include about how a program's going and how you've been able to assess the performance of a program. So there are ways and means. So even where you can't get formal evaluations done by an independent person, there are ways and means that you can go about having some form of assessment of how a program's going. For instance, relying on partners on the ground and their reports back to you, or indeed some clever members have managed to have academics come through and look at the performance of various programs. So there are ways and means. So it's just something to watch out for. That at the end of the day, you really need to be able to explain to your stakeholders how your programs are going, and ultimately that's what that bit's about, and how the means by which you've been able to assess that performance. Number 3 includes 4 mandatory notes that I've gone through a couple of times, but it's worth repeating because they're just forgotten by more members than should happen. So you should always have those 2 complaint statements, how members of the public and stakeholders can make a complaint, either directly to your organisation or to ACFID. You must state your commitment to the code. I mean, after all, that is why you are a member, because you are committed to the code. The code actually belongs to the members, so you should always be wanting to state your commitment to the code. And that the financial statements have been prepared in accordance with the code. That needs to be visible somewhere in and around where the financial statement section of the report is. That final one. Once again, I've touched on this point a few times. Some members do get confused by the annual report requirements and the need to put code-compliant financials in the annual report, and your statutory requirement to produce full financial statements. Even though we mandate what goes in the annual report, that's all we can mandate. The statute that you operate under will mandate what statutory accounts you need to prepare, but ACFID, for the moment, requires to see those full financial statements. So we mandate what goes in the annual report, and you must produce code-compliant financials for the annual report, but we also require, as part of our reporting process, to also receive your full financial statements. And all that will now be done within the compliance portal. So for most members, you'll be sending in an annual report that contains code-compliant portal. So for most members, you'll be sending in an annual report that contains code-compliant financials, and you'll also be sending in your full financial statements. And those full financial statements, or your statutory accounts, will include your governing body declaration. So we'll generally receive those 2 documents. Some members choose to put the whole of their full financial statements in the annual report. That's fine, you can do that, as long as they are code compliant. So that's the important proviso there. I think we are nearing the end. I'll quickly mention a couple of things. There's a financial review standing committee that oversights all these financial reporting requirements, and we meet about once a quarter, and we do oversight how members are going. We do try and think up of ways to help members. That checklist I referred to earlier. was initially developed within the FRSC, and we even make changes to the toolkit to improve its readability. So they actually do oversight and actually do stuff related to things that affect you directly. And the next one has changed its name, so apologies, I haven't updated this. This refers to the Finance Managers Working Group. It's now called the Finance Community of Practice, and I can quickly bring that up. So once again, it's under my ACFID, and there's a section called Collaborate. So if you go into Collaborate, you'll find all the communities of practice, including the finance one. And it's a bit like the old Basecamp, if you're familiar with that. You can start threads or put in comments to threads that others have started, and emails get circulated to all those who have signed in to that community of practice. And it's starting to get used more and more, and I encourage you to check it out, get involved, at least leave a comment on something to see how it all works, and I think that will become a very useful tool over time. Final tips, some obvious things, just contact us if you're running late. We're generally quite open to giving you extra time to lodge your various documents. Just double check that there's no ongoing compliance issues from the previous year that you need to deal with, because if they go 2 years running, that just really is hassle for everyone. It just means we do need to be a bit stricter when it's 2 years running. So as a third point, repeated remedials, we'll sort of be a bit harder on that. That fourth dot point, once we've ascertained that that you're fully compliant in both the annual reporting and the CSA, and or if one or the other hasn't been assessed for that year, you'll then get your certificate of compliance, and that will generally happen about 5 months after you're reported. I think that's it. Feedback email will be sent out to ask you about how the course went. Thanks for your time, everyone. Thanks for those questions that came through. I think that was really useful, that I was able to get through a few specific questions. And I think I should take this opportunity as well to say today is actually my last day at ACFID. My 1 year contract's completed, and I'm going back to retirement. But we've already started. There's already action in train to find a replacement, and when that person comes in, I'll come in and show them the ropes, as Catherine Horner did for me, who you may know from previous years, and things will keep going. Just let me say, it's been really nice working with ACFID and working with the membership. So I know I've had dealings with nearly all of you, and it's really been a pleasure the whole way through. So thanks, everyone. And yes, thanks, Jan. Thanks, Phil.